By 483 BCE, Rome had already been warring with the Etruscans for what felt like an eternity. The city of Veii, in particular, was a thorn in Rome's side, with constant raids and threats of invasion. And yet, even with these early wars, neither side had been able to really assert themselves as the most powerful Italian state. However, the landscape was beginning to change. Rome had fully asserted itself over the Latin city-states, or were at least militarily aligned with them, and now probably controlled all of Latium and portions of Campania. In fact, they probably looked a little something like this. I should note here that this map may or may not be accurate, as borders as we think of them didn't really exist at this time, so we are forced to kind of guess. Because of this, it was now time for Rome to turn its eyes further outward for expansion. There were three main avenues. They could go north and fight with the Etruscans, they could go southeast and attack the Samnites, or they could go fully to the south and fight the Volsci. The choice was probably fairly easy to make. First of all, the Romans already hated the Etruscans. They had been fighting essentially from the founding of Rome. Even Romulus fought Veii and Fidene, two Etruscan city-states, during his reign as king. Of the 7 kings of Rome, we know for a fact that 4 kings fought against the Etruscans in some way, shape, or form, and we have suspicions or mentions of war with the Etruscans for a further 2 kings. In fact, the only king that we are fairly positive did not fight the Etruscans is Numa Pompilius, the only peaceful king of Rome. This is all to say that fighting the Etruscans was really in the blood of Rome. The other routes of expansion also created their own special problems. If the Romans chose the Samnites, they would have to deal with the Apennine Mountains. These mountains aren't the largest or the most daunting mountains in the world, but any incline or tough terrain could change the course of not only a battle, but an entire war. It would take some serious manpower and dogged determination to attack and defeat the Samnites, 2 things that Rome didn't quite have in 483 BCE. Of course, that would eventually change, but for now, Rome couldn't quite defeat the Samnites. To the south, the Volsci were kind of the same story. The Apennines didn't quite extend into Volsci territory, but they had a different geographical feature to protect them, and that was marshes. Marshes were, and really still are, a nightmare for invasions. It's tough to march through, it's tough to camp in as the land isn't really solid, there are more insects than you can possibly imagine, and those insects just so happen to carry some of the worst diseases imaginable. Because of this, an invasion of the Volsci was not very attractive. The Etruscans in their lands did not have the same issues. Tuscany, the area where the Etruscans lived, was flat with solid land. In fact, it was essentially the same in terms of geography as Latium. Because of this, Rome did not face the same tactical problems that they would with the Samnites or the Volsci, and they had centuries of experience fighting in lands that looked a lot like Tuscany or Etruria. Plus, they really hated the Etruscans. It was really a win-win. This, of course, did not mean that Rome didn't fight the Volsci or the Samnites in the 480s, or even prior. They certainly did. But this does mean that Rome would decide to focus most of its offensive capabilities on the Etruscans. These wars really started in the Regal Period. However, I have already made videos on each Roman king, and the wars with the Etruscans are covered in those videos, so check those out if you want more information on those. I will leave them linked in the description. And while you're there, maybe consider subscribing and liking. Anyway, today, as the first sentence in the video probably clued you into, we are going to start in 483 BCE, the year that the Roman Republic and the Etruscans really fought for the first time. There had been minor skirmishes and raids prior to 483, but the First World War was about to begin. At this point in Roman history, the Republic was dominated by the gens Fabia. In fact, between 485 BCE and 479 BCE, they held at least one of the consulships 7 straight times, a feat almost unparalleled in Roman history. You will notice that this almost exactly coincides with the first war under the Republic with the Etruscans. Because of this war in 483 and the couple of successive wars, which are normally lumped together with the war in 483, became a sort of personal endeavor of the Fabia family. Due to this, these wars are sometimes called the Fabian Wars, so if I call them that, this is where that comes from. This all starts in 483 BCE, where the Vians, people from the city of Veii, along with various auxiliaries from other Etruscan cities, decided they wished to invade Rome. Now, the Romans were not stupid, and because of this, they had stocked the cities closest to Veii in the Etruscan border with strong garrisons. For the first year or so, these cities were able to hold the line, and Rome itself was fairly unconcerned with the invasion. The Roman political system was still embroiled in the conflict of the orders, and as such, they were really distracted by social and political unrest within the city itself. This is a fairly common theme in this period. Rome is invaded or faces some sort of outside threat, and for the first year or two they ignore it, and the opposing army is typically held back by the garrisons of the border cities. However, by the end of the first year or so, the border cities are exhausted, and the enemy is able to penetrate parts of the Roman countryside. As these enemies advance on Rome itself, or other important cities, the Romans finally get their act together and pause their social conflict to go fight. This time was really no different. For most of 483, the Romans ignored the threat. By 482, however, the threat could no longer be ignored, as Veii began to fully ravage the countryside. The threat was apparently so severe that Livy tells us that Veii credibly threatened to siege Rome itself if Rome continued to be so passive. This was unacceptable, and Rome began to assemble its legions with command given over to Spurius Furius Fusu, the consul for the year. However, as it takes time for armies to assemble, nothing of note really happened in 482 nor 481. You might be asking why. Why are we told that Veii could nearly siege Rome, but suddenly the fighting just stops and the two sides sit mostly inactive for a time? Well, there could be two explanations for this. The first is that our information is just completely wrong. Perhaps there were battles, or at least skirmishes, and Livy and other Roman historians simply didn't have the sources to put those battles into their writings. However, it's actually not all that unbelievable to think that the two sides actually did observe some sort of pause in fighting. Firstly, it was extremely difficult, expensive, and time-consuming for armies to march at this point in history. The troops had to walk, the same troops needed to be fed and watered, and each soldier needed to be paid. Because of this, prolonged wars were commonplace. In fact, it was even common for wars to literally pause during the fall and winter months, before resuming again in the summer and spring months. Perhaps the Etruscans ran out of funds or food, or were faced with seriously bad weather that delayed their march. Any or all of these things could have slowed or even completely stopped the war. Whatever the case, we are told that it was really only in 480 that things began to really heat up. At this point, Rome was still caught between internal conflict and uniting together to fight off the Etruscan invasion. The Etruscans knew this. In fact, it had been one of the reasons they invaded in the first place, and they decided to take to the battlefield once again. The two consuls, Marcus Fabius Vabellunus and Gnaeus Manlius Cincinnatus, were given command of all the forces Rome could muster, and set out to fight. We don't really know where this ultimate battle occurred. We can assume it was probably somewhere in Roman territory, as we know that the Etruscans had advanced deep into Latium by this point. Both of the consuls were wary of this battle. At this point, Rome was not the militaristic powerhouse that we think of in the modern day. In fact, most of the legions were likely untrained men who held little to no discipline. This normally wasn't a huge problem, as typically the same could be said of the opposing army. However, in this case, we should remember that the Etruscan army had been raiding and skirmishing across Roman territory for the past 2 years, and while the people of Rome were still in a massive dispute back home, thus impeding the training of the legions, the Etruscans faced no such problems, at least that we know of. Rome probably faced a fairly large training and readiness disadvantage. Marcus Fabius especially understood this, and repeatedly refused to allow the Roman army to engage until the Etruscan cavalry had essentially made it impossible not to respond. We are told that at this point Marcus Fabius turned back to his men and told them they would only be allowed to engage if every single one of them swore to the gods to return victorious. We might laugh or scoff at this today as a half-assed, non-important measure, but to the Romans this was serious, the most serious oath anyone could take. These oaths were binding, and the Romans truly believed that if you did not follow through, the gods themselves would not only ensure that the rest of your life was miserable, but that your afterlife was just as miserable. These oaths were not taken nor requested lightly. We are told that the first person to step forward and take the oath was a centurion named Marcus Fabiolus. Marcus Fabiolus swore upon the anger of Jupiter and Mars, two of the most important and sacred gods of Rome, that the army would return victorious, or not return at all. Thereafter, the entire army repeated the oath. Marcus Fabius then gave the command to engage, and the Roman army charged forward. At first, the Romans fought like men possessed. This fervor was inflamed when Quintus Fabius, brother to Marcus Fabius, was slain. Marcus Fabius and his other brother, Caeso, leapt over the dead body of their brother and urged the Roman army to continue their fighting. For a time, it seemed as though Rome would easily triumph. This changed when the other consul, Gnaeus Manilius, who was leading the opposite flank, was grievously wounded. We are not told what exactly the wound was, but we are told that it was so bad Gnaeus was forced to retreat from the battle, and the troops were left leaderless. Somehow, Fabius quickly received word of the injury and hurried over to rally the wavering troops. Fabius implored his troops to continue to fight, and a brief appearance by the wounded Manilius reassured the men enough to strengthen their resolve. The Etruscans, though, were not willing to let such an opportunity go to waste. In the chaos and lull this injury created, a portion of their troops broke off and rounded on the Roman encampment. The camp, being lightly guarded by the reserve Roman troops, was unable to repulse the attack. Luckily, at least for the Romans, word was able to escape from the attack and bring news of the move to the remaining consul, Marcus Fabius. Marcus instantly pulled a portion of the fighting men back and surrounded the exits to the Roman camp. He was quickly joined by the injured Manilius. The Etruscans, now surrounded and desperate to make their escape, attempted to assault the consul's positions. Fabius and his portion of the men held strong, and for a time so did Manilius and his men. However, after several charges and volleys of arrows were exchanged, Manilius eventually fell to the ground with a mortal wound. The surrounding soldiers panicked, and the Etruscans charged forward. One of Manilius's officers moved the consul's dead body from the exit and ordered the remaining soldiers to retreat. The Etruscans saw their chance and began to flee from the camp. However, apparently, Marcus Fabius anticipated such a move and had already turned his men towards the other exit. The Etruscans, likely out of their desperate fear and possibly their exhaustion, broke ranks and essentially began to flee back towards the other portion of their army, which was still engaged in a fight with the Romans back on the field. Marcus Fabius ordered his men to charge towards this fleeing column, and we are told that they were all slaughtered as they fled. Following this, the army still remaining on the field quickly surrendered, and Rome won the day. Although Marcus Fabius had won a great victory, the cost was high, not only for the Roman state, but for Marcus himself. His brother had died, countless comrades had also died, and his co-consul and friend had died as well. Because of this, Marcus Fabius became one of the very, and I mean very, few Romans to ever refuse a triumph. Instead, Marcus gave the eulogies at the funerals of his brother and his co-consul. He also saw that his injured troops were taken care of by placing them in the homes of the patricians, where they were cared for on the dimes of the various patrician families. And for a time, Rome held the upper hand, and the war died down once again. However, this is not where the story of this series of wars, nor the story of Marcus Fabius and his family ends. Join me next time when we discuss the wars of 479, 478, and 476 BCE. Will Rome triumph over Veii? Will the Fabia family win their personal struggle against the Etruscan city? And will Marcus Fabius further cement his name in Roman history? Join me next time as we attempt to find out. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. I quickly want to apologize for not having the video on Etruscan religion out just yet. Ran into some difficulties in trying to shorten the episode and just couldn't finish in time. That video should be up on Tuesday, July 18th, however. Hopefully you all can forgive me. If you have any comments or questions on the video or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, it really helps the channel out. Peace.